World of Warcraft, Rise of the Horde by Christy Golden. Chapter 16. The Shadow Council, even now, so many years on, we know so little about who they were and what they did. Gul'dan carried many, many secrets to his grave. He may rot there in torment. It is difficult enough for me to understand how one or two may become so corrupt that they would doom their own descendants for power in their lifetimes. That there were so many, the number is not even known for certain, is beyond the scope of my limited imagination. Yet even those numbers would not have mattered had it not been for the demons who held them in their grasp, their pain. I rejoice in what they did to others who obeyed them because they trusted them. I condemn with every fiber of my being. That was an excellent test, Kil'jaeden approved. Smiling at his subjects, Gul'dan bowed, his eyes bright with his master's approval. Ner'zhul hunkered down, his eyes on the floor, but even so he was listening. I confess, I was surprised Durotan was able to carry out our orders, Gul'dan said. I expected him to resist, or at least put shackles on what his orcs could and could not do. But the city lies claimed and broken. My lord, all the Draenei who once lived there are gone, most of them dead. Most is not good enough, Gul'dan. You know that. Gul'dan flinched slightly at the criticism. He wondered, not for the first time, about the connection between Kil'jaeden and the Draenei, and why the Beautiful One was so despised them. It was our first attempt at taking the battle to them. Rather than attack our own hunting party's master, Great One. The warlock replied, a little surprised at his own daring. Kil'jaeden cocked his horn-red head, considered, then nodded. True, and yet there is time. It had been several days since the fall of Tel Mor. Gul'dan, impressed with the job Durotan had done, had tried to give the city to the Frostwolf clan as a reward, but Durotan had declined the offer. The Frostwolf, he stated, would continue to live in their ancestral lands. The Blackrocks, however, had not been so foolish. Blackhand and his family now slept in the beds where the Magister of the city had once slept. At first, the Orcs had not known what to make of the trappings of the Draenei, but now they were beginning to incorporate their victims' way of life into their own. They sat in chairs, ate at tables, analyzed and trained with the Draenei weaponry, adapted the armor for bulkier orcish frames. Some of the females, and not a few of the males, of the Blackrock clan had taken to wearing Draenei clothing, incorporating it with traditional Draenei tunics, robes, and breeches. Gul'dan knew that many wondered why he or Ner'zhul had not taken the city for themselves. It was tempting, but Gul'dan had been well advised by his master. Creature comforts were pleasant, but power was sweeter. And the less Gul'dan claimed for himself publicly, the greater his reach would be in secret. Kil'jaeden would not let him down. As long as Gul'dan did his master's work well, a few items were brought to this new place he called home. An enormous circular table carved of wood, inlaid with soft glowing shells and stones, along with several beautiful chairs. Gul'dan stepped forward to the massive table, running his hand over the polished surface, smiling to himself. All that remained was to summon those whom Gul'dan had reason to believe would answer. Some names were immediately obvious to him. Others came only with extended thoughts. But he had a list of names now that was long enough to be comprehensive, short enough to be managed. Sooner than he had even hoped the Shadow Council would form. While on the outside, Gul'dan was advising the Orcs as a race, giving them power and eliminating the enemy that was the Draenei. A handful of Orcs almost as corrupt and power-hungry as he would pull the strings. It was not about the Orcs as a race. It had never been about the Orcs as a race. It was about power, getting it, wielding it, and keeping it. Ner'zhul had never understood that. He liked the power, but was not willing to feed it the meat it craved. The end, Kil'jaeden demanded. Deceit, lies, manipulation, even Blackhand, who thought he was initiated into Gul'dan's ultimate schemes, hadn't grasped the vastness of Gul'dan's ambitions. It was huge as Kil'jaeden's desire to destroy the Draenei. It was as enormous as the sky, as deep as the ocean, as knife-sharp as hunger. Gul'dan looked at Ner'zhul with contempt as the older orc who had once been his mentor sat huddled in a corner. His gaze traveled to the blazing eyes of Kil'jaeden, and the great being nodded. "Summon them," Kil'jaeden said. His lips parted in a smile, showing sharp white teeth. "They will come when you call, and they will dance in your tune. I will see to that." Allies. They needed allies. Gul'dan wondered how Kil'jaeden had not foreseen this. The Orcs were mighty indeed, especially when controlled and directed properly. The long months, over a year now, that this war had stretched, had only made them more so. The best brains had gone to work on understanding the technology of the Draenei as best they could. Building had begun on a center fortress, which Gul'dan called the Citadel, where a standing army could be conveniently quartered, trained, and equipped. The Orcs had never before attempted anything like this, and Gul'dan was proud that he had suggested the idea. They were warriors. They were shaman, now of course warlocks. There were healers. There were craftsmen. The first three had clear roles and no lack of opportunity to perform their duties. The craftsmen were contributing on a different level, creating the armor and the weapons and the buildings to support those who had the glory of slaughtering Draenei under their bodies were sickly with spilled blood. Some would call these laborers a lower class of orc. Privately, Gul'dan felt that way himself, but he always wise enough to know that their work, while heartily glamorous or likely to gain them recognition, was as necessary as a warrior's willingness to kill or a warlock's mastery of curses. Those who provided food, shelter, weapons, the warriors and the warlocks would not get very far without them. So Gul'dan made a show praising the craftsmen, the pleasant result being that they were inspired to work harder and continually improve. But even though every member of the clan was working as hard as he could, and Gul'dan had spies in each clan to make certain of it, it was not going to be enough. The taking of Telmore had been surprisingly easy, and the boost to morale was tremendous. But Gul'dan knew that the Horde's victory was largely due to luck. No one in that sheltered city believed for a moment they would be discovered and overrun in a matter of few hours. They had thought themselves completely and utterly safe, protected by the magic of the green stone. Gul'dan had dabbled Leaf Shadow, which shielded them first from Ogre Eyes and then from Orcish. That easy victory would not be repeated. How would... "Ogres," he said out loud, thoughtfully. He tapped one sharp fingernail against his jutting chin. "Ogres." "Absolutely not," cried Blackhand. He closed the distance between himself and Gul'dan in 2 strides, towering over the smaller orc. It took every ounce of bravado Gul'dan had not to retreat from that fearsome face shoved within an inch of his. "Come now, Blackhands," Gul'dan smoothed. "Calm yourself and listen to what I am saying. You will be the one to benefit the most from this, after all. That got him. Blackhand growled, snorted, and stepped back. Gul'dan did his best not to look obviously relieved. They are filth. They have long been enemies of the Orc, longer than the Draenei, and with better reason. How is it that I will be benefit? Get right to the point, Gul'dan thought. With satisfaction, he had judged Blackhand properly. There are some who still mutter that you were not elected fairly, Gul'dan said. If you succeed in this, it would only add more glory to your name. Blackhand's eyes narrowed. Perhaps, he admitted. But will the Orcs agree to this? Gul'dan permitted himself a smile. They will if you tell them, he replied. Blackhand threw his head back and roared with laughter. Orgrim shifted uneasily in his saddle as he glanced at his leader. When Blackhand had explained what he wanted to do, Orgrim had erupted in protest. He had joined in countless hunting parties over the years to eliminate the ogre threats, more than most orcs. With him, it was personal. He had never ceased hating the fact that years ago he had fled from one of the giant, lumbering, thick-skulled creatures. And now, Blackhand proposed this. But Orgrim knew that whatever else his leader was, and he was many things that Orgrim did not like, he was a good strategist. The plan was sound, if one could detach oneself emotionally from it, so he had agreed to lend his support. Obtaining information had been tricky. The Black Rock had captured 3 of the ogres and spent many long nights speaking in sufficiently small words to get their point across before the deceptively pudgy things understood what they now wanted and began to cooperate. Now, every warrior, warlock, and healer from the entire enormous clan stood prepared for battle. The ogres had told them where their masters lurked and led them to this place. An opening at the foot of the Blade Edge mountain chain. They had made no attempt to hide themselves. Refuse littered the area outside, and there were plenty of large, bare ogre footprints going in and out. Even as Orgrim watched, he saw a small group of ogres trundling out into the daylight. No doubt they had thought themselves safe, as the Draenei and Telmor had before them, and no doubt a year ago they would have been right. But much changed since then. The Orcs were no longer groups of scattered clans, but a unified fighting force willing to put aside an old grudge for a new hatred. Blackhand was in the front, flanked by 3 ogres. Behind him were his sons, Ren and Maim, who spoke to one another in low voices, punctuated by the occasional rough giggle. Orgrim had been against allowing the boys to fight at first, but they had proven to be stronger and better than one might think. They lacked their father's cunning, but they certainly had inherited his bloodlust. Griselda, too, had been trained to fight, but she was not a natural the way the boys were. The names were appropriate. Their father shot them an angry look, and they sobered at once. Orgrim wondered if Blackhand would make a speech. He hoped not. Blackhand was the best in action, not words, and his clan was more than ready to follow him. To his relief, Blackhand looked over the sea of warriors, nodded once, and then gave the order to attack. The first wave charged, screaming wildly and pouring down the side of the foothills where they had hidden. At first, the ogres were confused at the sight of 3 of their own allying with the orcs, that they simply stood and let themselves be slaughtered. Then, as their slow brains began to comprehend that they were under attack, they rallied. They still did not attack their fellow ogres, who lumbered through their ranks to talk to the head of the guards stationed somewhere inside the cavern. Orgrim was determined to enjoy the last authorized ogre killing he was likely to taste, and swung the Doomhammer with something to akin of glee. His wolf was swift and darted easily between the tree-trunk thick legs of the ogre, who raged impotently and swung his club as fiercely as he could. He recalled how big they seemed to him as a child. They were still big, but so was he. Now, he wielded a legendary weapon with control and skill. He fractured the shin bone of the ogre, and it roared in agony. Orgrim's wolf danced out of the way as the huge thing fell, making the earth tremble as it landed. It tried to get up, pushing its bulk off the ground with its large, flat hands. But by then, other black rocks had swarmed upon it. Faster even than Orgrim could reckon, the ogre was dead and bleeding from over 24 wounds. Orgrim wheeled just in time to see one of the orcish warriors hurtling through the air, dead from a single blow from the ogre's massive club. Growling, Orgrim gathered himself to charge the murdering creature when a cry of "Hold! Hold!" brought up short. It was a testament to the power of Black Hand's personality that even now, even when most of the Black Rocks were caught in the grip of bloodlust and killing an ancient enemy, they stayed their hands. The ogres didn't, at least not at once, and Orgrim found himself running away from the battle until the slow ogre brains understood what was going on. The thought gallied him. "It is for the good of all of us, Orgrim," he told himself. Glanced over to see the ogres the Black Rocks had befriended talking to their kin, or rather, bellowing at them and occasionally smacking them. But at least the ogres had been distracted from following the retreating orcs and appeared to be listening. One of them, bigger and wearing something that looked like an official sash, could not understand the vile things and used the pause to catch his breath and gulp some water. "Can't wait until we kill them again," Ren said. Orgrim glanced at his chieftain's eldest son. "If we succeed, they'll be fighting alongside us," Orgrim replied. "You won't be allowed to kill them." Maim spat. "Right, kill them on the sly." Orgrim grimaced. He himself would like nothing better, but several are dead already, trying to make this plan of your father's work. He wouldn't like you undermining his efforts. Ren sneered at him. "Who's going to tell him?" "I will. If this works, and they listen to us, if any of them turn up dead, yours are the first names I'll mention." Ren glowered. Right now, he was so young that it looked like childish petulance, but inwardly, Orgrim was touched with foreboding. He never liked Black Hand, and liked his children with the exception of little Grizda, even less. He did not know if it was their parentage or their forced growth that was responsible, but there was a darkness in them that Orgrim mistrusted. One day, if they survived and began using their brains in addition to their powerful muscles, Ren and Maim would grow up to be even more dangerous and deadly than their father. "I told you you wouldn't listen, Ren," Maim said, puantly. "Old man's forgotten what it's like to have bloodlust running through him. Let's go." The final sneer, Ren followed his brother. Orgrim sighed. He had bigger problems than two upstart youngsters right now. He turned his attention back to the negotiations, although he doubted the ogres would have understood the word. The attacks appeared to have stopped. Blackhand, who had fled the battlefield as he had told all his clan to do, now directed his wolf back down to where the ogres were gathered. Orgrim rode to his chieftain's side, arriving just in time to hear the leader of the guard announce, "We know that Gran. Gran hurt us." He beckoned to one of the other ogres, who turned to show his back to Orgrim and Blackhand. Orgrim saw that there were scars crisscrossing the ogre's back. He felt no twinge of pity for the creature. They had done worse to the ogres for decades. Still, was useful to know. The captured ogres had also spoken of such things, and now they nodded as if they were terribly wise. "What you give us if we join?" demanded the guard. Blackhand grinned up at the thing. "Well, for one thing, we won't beat you." Orgrim thought of Blackhand's own sons, but said nothing. "We will see to it that you are fed and given appropriate weapons." Orgrim was relieved that Blackhand hadn't promised armor. 3 orcs could be armored out of the material that would protect a single ogre, and fortunately the guard, obviously one of the more intelligent of the ogres, still wasn't smart enough to think of armor himself. "We have food and shelter, and the delight of smashing Draenei to small wet stains on the grass." The ogres had been listening intently, and now one of them literally jumped up and down with delight. "Smash!" It roared gleefully, and several others took up the simple but apparently highly entertaining phrase. Blackhand waited for enthusiasm to die down before continuing. "So we are agreed?" The ogre captain nodded. "No more hunting of the ogres," he growled, and turned to regard those he led. His tiny eyes were shining with tears, and this time as he looked upon the ogres, whose backs were crawling with scars, Orgrim did feel a little sorry for them. A little. "What is your name?" Orgrim asked the captain suddenly. He shifted his gaze to him. "Kroll," he said. "Kroll, then," said Blackhand quickly before his second could say any more. "When do you think we should lead our combined assault?" "No!" Kroll said. And before either Orgrim or Blackhand could protest, he bellowed something in his hideous native tongue. The other ogres jumped up and down, and the earth shook as they landed. Then they all turned and purposely re-entered the cave mouth. Blackhand cast a glance over at Orgrim, who shrugged. He suspected it was easier to stop the tide than this flood of stupid, single-minded giants. "Call them," Blackhand said. Orgrim produced a cleft hoof's single horn and blew on it. The orcs cried out in delight and began again to descend in response. There was no time to remind the Blackrock clan of the plan. Orgrim hoped they would remember it, especially the overzealous Maim and Ren. Slaughter of the ogres apparently awaited them, but they had damned well better be killing the right ones. Because if they didn't, they gave the ogres any reason to question this sudden and very particular alliance, and the babes and the old male and female who awaited word at the encampment might be all that remained of the Blackrock clan. Orgrim was not optimistic. Blackrock clan had ever been fierce in the hunt. Blackhand was a little more than a cunning savage, and Orgrim had not failed to observe that recently a sort of manic fury had begun to creep through all the clans. As he whirled his wolf around to charge into the cave with his fellow clan members, he wondered if perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him. Surely the greenish tinge on the skin of the orcs next to him was nothing more than a trick of the light. Chapter 17. Home. Whatever race you are, it is a word, a concept, that makes a heart swell with longing. Home can be ancient ancestral lands or new place that one has made one's own. Home can be even found in the eyes of the beloved. But we all need it, yearn for it. Know that without a home of some sort, we are incomplete. For many years, each clan had its home, its own sacred land, its own spirits of earth, air, fire, water, and spirit of the wilds. The uprooting began and continued, each more shattered than the last, until we came to Kalimdor. Here, I found a home for a wandering people, a place of rest and sanctuary where we could regroup and build. Home, for me, is now named for my father, the land of Durotar. Durotan lifted his head and sniffed the wind. The scent that filled his nostrils was one of dust and desiccation. An acrid sort of odor. Not the smell of something burning. Not quite, but similar. Once Drekthar would have been able to catch the scent even better than he, but those days had passed. He was no longer a shaman, but a warlock. The air would not waft to him when asked, bearing information as detailed as if it had been written on a piece of parchment. And worse, Drekthar, along with the other warlocks of the Frostwood clan, did not particularly seem to care. There had been no rain for some time, and the summer seemed hotter than usual. It was the second summer in a row that rain had come scantily, if at all, and on a whim, Durotan knelt and dug his fingers into the soil. Once it had been fertile loam, dark brown and emitting a rich, earthly scent. Now his fingers plunged easily into the dust. Its crust crumbled beneath his fingers, yielding instantly to dissolve into sand that would not hold grasses or crops, would not hold anything. It stiffed through his fingers like water. He sensed Dreka's approach, but did not turn around. Her arm slipped around his waist from behind, and she pressed against him. They stood like that for a long moment. Then, with a final squeeze, she released him and stepped around to face him. Durotan dusted off his hands. We have never relied that much on what we could grow anyways, he said quietly. Dreka regarded him with her dark, knowing eyes. His heart ached to look at her in so many ways. In so many ways, she was better than he. But she was the mate of the chieftain, not the chieftain. And she did not have to make the choices he did. The choices he had. We have all depended upon what we could hunt, Dreka said. But the animals we hunt survive on what the earth produces. We are all connected. The shaman knew that. She fell silent as one of the younger warlocks hurtled by. A small, caspering thing at its heels. As they passed, the little thing turned to look at Dreka and smiled, showing a mouth crammed full of pointed teeth. Dreka could not suppress the shudder. Durotan sighed and handed her a scroll. I just received this. We must prepare for a long march. We are to leave our lands. What? Blackhand's orders. He has relocated to this new citadel that has been made for him, and he wants his army there. It's no longer enough for us to join together to attack. We must all live together and be ready to follow where Blackhand leads us. Dreka stared up at him incredulously. Then her eyes dropped to the scroll. She read it quickly, then rolled it and handed it to him. "You had best prepare," she said quietly, then turned and strode back to the tent. He watched her go and wondered exactly what it was that made his heart break at the sight. The citadel was incomplete, but the moment it came to Durotan's sight, he stopped dead in his tracks. Beside him, there were several odd murmurs. So powerful, so big, worthy of a war chief. Had Durotan spoken, he would have said, blasphemous, blight on the land, out of harmony with everything we are. The traveling Frostwood clan was still many leagues distant, but the citadel perched on top of the horizon like a buzzard. There was nothing in its design that bespoke orcish buildings. This structure, this architectural nightmare, this offense to the eye and spirit was larger even than the Draenei buildings. Of course, Durotan knew its purpose. It would have to be enormous if it were to consistently house an elite force of orcish warriors. Still, he had expected something else. Instead of the smooth, sleek lines that marked the structures of the Draenei, this fortress was sharp and jagged. Instead of coexisting with the landscape, it dominated it. Hewn from black stone and jagged wood and metal, it fairly bristled against the sky. Durtan knew that he could only see the main tower from here, but that was enough. He stood as if rooted to the spot, reluctant to take a single step closer to the monstrosity. A silent look passed between him and Dreka. Were they the only ones who saw? The rest of the Frostwolves moved forward, passing their chieftain. Reluctantly, Durtan squeezed his mount and continued. Proximity to the fortress did nothing to make it seem more attractive. Now, Durtan could see other buildings, barracks, storage silos, a flat expanse of training area that were crowded with large weapons he had never seen before. They, too, looked dark and dangerous and deadly. Officious members of the Blackrock clan and others greeted Durtan perfunctorily. Didn't say that word right, did I? And sent the Frostwolves to a flat area in the western part of the complex to begin setting up tents. It was heading on toward dusk when Durtan received a summons to report to the courtyard of the Citadel along with several others from his clan. The group of about 20 walked the distance and waited. He heard the drums first. In the distance, Durtan tensed. They had specifically been instructed not to bring any weapons, just to come and wait for... They were not told what to wait for. Draka glanced at him uneasy. He had no assurance to offer her. He was as in the dark about what was to unfold as she. The drums came closer. The earth began to vibrate beneath Durtan's feet. Such was not unusual when the drumming started in circle, but so far away? He heard other concerned murmurs and that he was not the only one with a twinge of apprehension. The earth continued to shake, the vibrations growing stronger. 2 Blackrock riders approached, looking exalted. "Do not fear, proud members of the Horde," one of them cried. "Our new allies brought to our ranks by the mighty Black Hand are approaching. Welcome them." There was something familiar in the feel of the ground shaking. The only other time Durtan had ever experienced such a thing was when he had been fighting ogres! Someone screamed, and indeed, Durtan could see them. Dozens of them, huge and purposeful, were striding towards the gathering group of orcs. More wolf riders from the Blackrock clan were trotting about, shouting and blowing horns in triumph. The crowd was growing intense with delight, yelling and dancing and cheering wildly. These were the new allies? Durtan could scarcely believe it. Even as he stared, unable to find words, the biggest ogre he had ever seen appeared. Blackhand himself strode beside it, his movements as lithe and proud as if the mammoth thing did not make him look like a child's toy. "We will crush the Draenei!" Blackhand bellowed, and as if they had been awaiting the cue, the ogres marching with him cried, "Crush! Crush! Crush!" For a sick, dizzying moment, Durtan was a child again, fleeing before such a monster. He blinked, and he again saw his mind's eyes, his father's strong frame smashed and broken, blood and life dripping onto the ground. Garad's skull crushed like a nut by a single blow from an orc's club. Orcs were fighting alongside monstrous, feeble-brained creatures in an effort to destroy an intelligent, peaceful race. The world had gone mad. Velen shuddered. His assistant was at his elbow, offering a warm, soothing drink, but the prophet waved it away. No comfort could come from a beverage now. No comfort could ever truly come again. He had grieved when word had come that Telmor had fallen, and with the city his dear friend Restalon. It had been even more painful to hear how the attack had occurred. Veled had seen something special in the youth Duratan had been, and his treatment at the orc's hand had only severed his served to confirm his faith in the chieftain of the Frostwolf clan. But now this. Durtan and Orgrim had been the only two orcs ever to witness how the Greenstone had protected the city. One of them had even memorized the incantation that would deactivate the stone's protective camouflage. A handful had escaped to flee here, the Temple of Karbur. Their wounds had been dressed, but there was nothing Velen or anyone else could do to heal their shattered spirits. But worse news was to come. The refugees did not tell of simple bows and arrows or axes or spears or hammers being the sole weapons of destruction. They spoke in low, hushed voices of greenish-black bolts of terrible pain, of torment beyond anything the shaman had hitherto inflicted upon their enemies. They spoke of creatures gibbering and capering at the feet of those who wielded this magic, based on suffering and agony. They spoke of Mineart. Suddenly, many things fell into place with a dreadful logic. The abrupt, irrational attacks by the orcs, their sudden increase in technology and skill, the fact that they had turned their backs on shamanism, a religion that, as Velen understood it, required a give-and-take relationship between the elemental powers and those who would wield them. Those who would command Mineart did not seek balance or harmony with their power. They sought dominance, just as Kil'jaeden and Archimonde had. The orcs were nothing more than pawns in the hands of the Eridar. Velen knew that he had the rest of the Draenei, the exiles, were the real targets. The orcish horde, augmented now with creatures that were immensely powerful, was the way by which Kil'jaeden sought to destroy him. For a brief moment, Velen wondered if perhaps the new leader of this horde would listen to reason. If he would turn to fight alongside the Draenei to overthrow Kil'jaeden once he learned how he'd been used. He dismissed that thought almost at once. It was probable that those who were being used by Kil'jaeden knew of the Eridar's true nature and purpose, and the offer of power likely seemed unbelievable as well as seductive. So had Archimonde and Kil'jaeden succumbed, and they were far older, stronger, and wiser than any orc. And now, his vision, adding insult to injury, a vision of the lumbering ogres allying with the orcs, something that he once would have dismissed as a dream, brought on by a too-rich meal. Now, he knew it to be the truth. Something had changed in the inherent nature of the orcs, so drastically, so irrevocably, that they had allied with creatures that they had hated for generations against the Draenei, the people they had been tentative friends with for almost as long. If this had happened elsewhere, the response would be simple. Velen would gather his people and flee, protected by the Naru, but the ship had crashed, and Cure was dying. There was no escape other than fighting against the horde and praying that somehow, some way, they would survive. Oh, Cure, my old friend. How I miss your wisdom now, and how bitter it is that you lie in the hands of an enemy who does not even understand that you exist. He held the stone known as Spirit's Song close to his heart, and felt the faintest of flickers from the dying Naru. Velen closed his eyes and bowed his head. Gul'dan looked around the room with utter satisfaction. Everything was going to plan. The Shadow Council had been meeting for some time now, and thus far, Gul'dan felt confident he had selected them well. They were all prepared, nay, eager, to turn their backs on their people in order to advance their own aspirations to power. They had accomplished so much already, acting through their puppet that was foolish enough to believe he was a true part of the council, rather than simply their mouthpiece. It had been easy to get him elected war chief, and as long as the council smiled and nodded at him for the few moments he had attended the meetings, he did not question his position. But Blackhand always departed before the real meetings began, sent off on some mission or other that made his barrel chest swell with pride. "Greetings," Gul'dan said as he slipped into his chair at the head of the table. As always, Ner'zhul lurked in a corner, never invited to sit with the others, but permitted to hear the conversations. Kil'jaeden had so instructed, and while Gul'dan was unsure as to why his benefactor desired this, he wanted nothing more than to stay in Kil'jaeden's good graces, and did not demur. The council murmured perfunctorily greetings, and Gul'dan got down to business. "How are the various clans reacting to the idea of the ogre allies? Kargath, let's start with you." The chieftain of the Shattered Hand clan grinned and grunted. "They're primed for bloodshed, and they do not care who helps them slit open Draenei throats." Rough laughter filled the cavern as many of the council nodded in agreement in the dim lights provided by the torches. Their eyes seemed to Gul'dan to glow orange. A few, however, scowled and did not join in the merriment. "I have heard protests from some in the White Claw clan," one said. "And Durotan of the Frostwolf still bears watching for all that he led the attack on Telmor." Gul'dan held up his hand. "Do not fear. I have had Durotan in my mind for some time." "Why has he not been eliminated?" Kargath growled angrily. "It would be easy to replace him with another, more in line with our plans. Durotan is becoming well known for disagreeing with Blackhand's position, and yours as well." "This is precisely why I need him alive," Gul'dan said, watching to see who understood without further explanation. He saw comprehension register on a few faces, while others still looked puzzled and angry. "Because he is known for a more moderate stance," Gul'dan continued, regretful that he had to spell it out for anyone on the council. "When he finally does go along with everything, everyone else who might have doubted goes with him. He speaks for many who do not dare speak for themselves. If Durotan agrees, so goes their logic. Then it must be right." As Kargath mentioned, the Frostwood clan is not the only one who appears to have reservations. "But what if there comes a time that he does not agree? Some line he is not willing to cross?" Gul'dan smiled frostily. "Then we deal with him in the way that best advances our power, without placing it at risk, as we always do." Gul'dan decided it was time to change the subject. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Speaking of those who have reservations, I have heard that there are some who continue to attempt to contact the elements and ancestors." One of the members looked uncomfortable. "I have attempted to dissuade them, but I cannot see how I can punish them for it. It was, after all, belief that the ancestors wanted us to attack the Draenei that even made it possible." He sounded a bit defiant. Gul'dan smiled reassuringly. "Yes, indeed. That was the bait that hooked them so deeply." He glanced over at Ner'zhul. The older shaman met his eyes and then glanced down quickly. Such had been the bait that hooked Ner'zhul as well. Bait that did not hold the same appeal for Gul'dan. "But it is no longer necessary," Gul'dan continued. "We must make sure that there is no turning back to the old ways. We have been lucky indeed in our campaign, and with the ogre's success is likely to continue. But if there are any setbacks, any battles that go poorly, then those who still hold shamanism close to their hearts may find an apprehensive ear. That won't do at all." He tapped his chin thoughtfully. We must do more than simply encourage warlock practices. We must actively discourage shamanism. It would be unfortunate for some reason the ancestors actually were able to communicate with their descendants. Again, he glanced at Ner'zhul. It had only been when Ner'zhul had traveled to the sacred mountain that he had been able to speak with the ancestors and discovered what had really been going on. Until that point, even as powerful a shaman as he was, Ner'zhul had been tricked by illusions. The answer, therefore, seemed simple. Deep in the disembodied dreaming floated the beings that were made of light. They had the memories of what had gone before, and they had glimpses into the future. Long had they dwelt here, fed by the other, who was like them but not like them, and whose sense was well into the heart of a slow passing. Until recently, they had dwelt in the state of being, not being, in peace and tranquility. But now defilement and hatred and danger had come. They could not reach the sleeping beloved living any longer, and the beloved living did not come as they used to replenish the sacred pool and unintentionally keep the other alive. Only the greatly deceived one had come, weeping and begging, but far too lost in the deception to be aided. Suddenly, their deep dreaming was disrupted. A tremor went through them. Pain savaged them, and they cried out for aid from the other, who could not help them, who could not help itself. The dark, unholy things that had once been beings of beauty were coming. The ancestors sensed their approach. They came inexorably, joining their powers, creating a ring of darkness and severance around the base of the mountain. Darkness, visible, danced from the twisting things who had followed Sargeras, lured by the promise of power, fed now with the promise of obliteration of everything. The ancestors felt the seething, focused hatred coalesce into a manifestation of greenish-black energy, whipping around like several tentacles, seeking a dreadful union. Slowly, inexorably, their stranglehold increased until the rope of shadow power choked the mountain, sealing it shut, preventing any orc from entering, any frantic soul from departing. And now the other two cried out in grief as the circle was sealed shut. For without the shaman to bring them water, it could not even continue to attempt to heal itself, and without the other, there would eventually be no ancestors. Far away in their sleep, the few orcs who still secretly thought of themselves as shaman trembled and wept. Their dreams corrupted into nightmares of endless torment and an inescapable doom.